I will present my papers as a work under construction, but I think everybody's work is under construction. I have changed the name of the article, I hope, because of while we were writing, we realized that perhaps our previous abstract and title didn't reflect what we have been written. I also would like to acknowledge Matías Alejandro Franchini is my co-author. He's also from the University of Brasilia. So the title of the proposal title is Global Environmental Politics in Brazil as Social Environmentalism, Society, Nature, Duality, and the Challenges of Anthropocene. Let me see if I can move this. Okay, so the premises of our paper is we start talking that there is an environmental crisis and that this crisis is caused by this exponential growth of human activities on their system with several consequences for several of our global planetary systems, not only climate, but also biodiversity, water. So we are, all the systems on the Earth are unbalanced because of human intervention. And some people are saying that we have moved to a new era on the planet that's called Anthropocene, because it means that human activities have been intervening so much on their systems that we don't, we are already parts of how nature operates in the planet. And therefore, there's a growing gap between the crisis that we have been already created and can created, and the concrete changes needed in the political economic system across the globe. And, okay, let me move around. Well, I'm not talking about in the paper we explain better what we mean by this, the environmental crisis or the global environmental crisis, but I will not talk about it anymore. We have all the indicators there in the paper. But the main argument is that we are, as human beings, already part of the natural systems because we have been intervening so much that there's no way to going back. But what we do have are some science papers. They have been showing that there are some limits, or I don't know, people don't like the word limits, but we do have some boundaries that perhaps we cannot move beyond them, otherwise the change can be reversible in several of the natural systems. But while we view this as a global problem, we argue for the need to bring local views and different local worldviews in order to build governance. And we try to show this empirically through some case studies in the Amazon, Brazil. And also we try to show that it's not only bringing local and global, local views to the global level, but to kind of bridge the gaps and show also that some developments that have been happening on the global level have been helpful for locals in the Amazon, for them to kind of move their agenda forward as well. And what we say is that from the encounter between the local and the global, mainly transnational movements, for instance, with the local grassroots movements, there has been some reconceptualizations. And two concepts we have been found in the Amazon. One is social environmentalism, and the other is social biodiversity. And this whole reconceptualization is the result of these networks that are being built from local to global. And also, what else? The other argument we have been trying to develop from debates and experience from the field, they indicated that to build a kind of Earth system governance or some kind of thing, there's a need to epistemological change in the way you conceptualize and consider governance that incorporates other forms of knowledge and other forms of comprehension of reality. So, and we have these underlying assumptions that we need to move beyond the duality of cognition and epistemology, especially the duality nature-society, in order to move beyond modernity. And finally, the recent debates on international relations beyond West and expansion of IR discipline, geographical borders, they corroborate to reshape these notions of global environmental politics and their system governance in the direction of overcoming the duality nature of society, anthropocentrism, and the preeminence of instrumental reason, the north-south and global-local gaps. So what we do in the first part of the paper, we problematize the way in which our theory has dealt with sustainability issues, focusing on two main features. We didn't have a name for this. We labeled this like a kind of vertical integration, or how IR theory has been lacking integration between different levels of analysis. I mean, state-centric views of international relations, so you don't look at what's happening at the subnational or local levels. And the other thing is more problematic is this what we have been calling horizontal integration. That is the absence of dialogue and synergy between different epistemologies and worldviews. So I'm skipping this because we didn't really develop in the paper was the first part, that is the critique, how the IR traditions have been dealing with sustainability. But I will be very short. Like realism is very state-centric. They don't deal with environmental issues because they're focused on security. And when they deal with environmental issues, this has to do with environmental security or war for resources, but no more than that. Liberal institutionalism has been focusing on mainly regime theory, regime effectiveness, multilateral negotiations, and how there are some norms that have been built, but they are not so effective on the local or national levels. And also the third set of theories that have been developed has to do with governance, global governance literature, system governance literature. And this literature has advanced a little bit more because they have been trying to deal with non-state actors. They have been less state-centric. And they have been capable to integrate some level of analysis, like local level actors, NGOs, and so we say that they're freer from some conceptual jails like global, local, north-south divisions, the governance literature. Realism and liberal institutionalism, they have serious deficits because most of them are related to state-centrism. They don't really go beyond the state. So in our view, to what we know of, no IR tradition has done major improvements to incorporate sustainability in a way that could move it forward. So, like, as we say, realism and liberal institutionalism are ontologically incapable of assimilating non-modern worldviews because of the rationalist structure of agent incentives. So they don't provide us analytical and epistemological instruments to see the environment and to go beyond this nature and nature society dualism and also anthropocentrism. The governance approaches that we have been looking at, perhaps they are epistemologically capable to incorporate other forms of knowledge, but the further this literature has gone, and that's what we know of, is multidisciplinarity. Like, for instance, there's system governance project. They have been trying to bridge gaps with the natural sciences, like putting together social and natural scientists, but it's only multidisciplinarity. And we have been reading is that perhaps we need to be not only multidisciplinary, but also transdisciplinary, and to incorporate arts, science, philosophy, and traditions. And also other ways of approaching reality, like reason, sensation, intuition, and emotion, reason, sensation, and intuition. Like the two sides of brains, because we have the right side and the left side of the brain. And the only way that we can move forward and can kind of bridge this gap in nature of society is trying to use the two sides of our brains. Well, it's complicated, but that's what we... So, to argue for this is something that we haven't solved in the paper because we have been moving perhaps in the abstract part of the paper, is we try to go deeper, studying this integration of knowledge systems and all ways of perceiving reality. And when we go empirically, we try to show this in a non-modern understanding of sustainable problems in the Amazon, but we couldn't really show all these dimensions in the empirical case. But anyway, the case study we used try to show that in order to have a non-modern understanding of the sustainable problems in the Amazon region and perhaps in elsewhere, it's central to integrate both different levels of governance and different epistemologies. So we see sustainability issues as social, environmental, and epistemological. So, in Brazil, so now I'll go more empirically so you can see how I've been building the argument. So in Brazil, there's this concept that has emerged from social activism and the encounter between the grassroots movements and then transnational NGOs, and this concept is called social environmentalism. And the underlying assumption that has been the assumption that underlies this concept that one cannot separate ecological sustainability from social sustainability, I mean social justice. And there are three principles that are implicit in this social environmental concept. One is ecological sustainability, the other is social justice, and the other is cultural diversity. This is a result of the movements that have been going on since the late 1980s, and has to do, as I said, with the encounter between these grassroots movements in the Amazon. Basically, the case I used is the rubber tappers in Acre, and also the riverine people from the Amazonas state, so a place that's 500 kilometers west from the Amazonas, or from Manaus. And the concept also has to do with the assumption that you have to bring in local peoples to decision-making, not only because of justice, but also because the knowledge they have about how dealing with the environment sometimes is the way forward to keep the forest up, for instance. Standing. Well, as we say in Brazil, the forest is standing. I don't know if this makes sense in English, but it means you don't have to slash and burn the forest in order to bring life quality improvement for locals. And the other thing is cultural diversity that has to do with traditional knowledge. The other concept, social biodiversity, is intrinsically related to the diversity of populations and cultures that exist in the Amazon and other parts of Brazil. And the concept has to do with that the existence of biodiversity is intrinsically related to the existence of social diversity. You cannot separate how you have the diversity of biomes or ecosystems and the diversity of populations. Okay, so they have been conceiving this as social biodiversity. And considering also, like you have in Brazil 230 people that with their own cultures, language, social organization, legal systems. Okay. We use these two cases I told you, rubber tappers and destructive reserves in Brazil. And as we show, the transnational coalition that formed between rubber tappers and North American environmental NGOs, for instance, the Environmental Defense Fund, were very important to develop this concept and also to create extractive reserves in Brazil, and also to change the legislation and all that, and gave this. And so this whole conceptualization of social environmentalism has to do with this local experience that has been going on in the whole Amazonia. Not only these two cases, okay? There are many other cases, but we didn't bring it over them. And the other was the creation of Mamirauá Sustainable Development Reserve. That's team of the work of a coalition that drew together the conservation movement, conservation biology, very Western, whatever, but also local communities that called the Movimento de Preservação de Lagos, that mean lake preservation movement. There's a very grassroots movement in Amazonas They have a long history of trying to defend their access to the river through fishing. There's one case that we bring as an unsolved business that is more complex because it has to do with access to genetic resources, benefit sharing, and traditional knowledge. So far, there's no, internationally, there's no sui generis mechanism to protect traditional knowledge. And the problem has to do with this, with how contemporary science does not recognize the legacy of the past and consider itself better than traditional knowledge. In our paper, we bring the case of the shamans in the Peruvian Amazonia. They use ayahuasca, and there's some anthropological works that they have seen that what the shamans see when they use the ayahuasca, well, this anthropologist has, he has shown that it's the structure of DNA. He sees a serpent, these shamans in the Peruvian Amazonian, and this is the same thing as science has been showing, that is the structure of the DNA. And so some anthropologists are arguing is that this kind of knowledge that comes from shamans are kind of knowledge that should be considered when we talk about sustainability and all that. I would like to quote something to try to finish, because I know that my time has gone. And, but what the indigenous people have been saying about how the modern way we have been treating. So when we talk about creating a patenting system for shaman knowledge, or body painting as industrial design, name of indigenous people as brands, or ritual as registration, books of celebrations, or lands and natural heritage, they are all representation of a segmented world view as a square world. And that shows a discrepancy between the value attributed to local local knowledge and the scientific knowledge. So what they mean is that you cannot really say that traditional knowledge is not as valuable as scientific or Western knowledge. So you cannot transform the shaman knowledge as patents or whatever. So to finish, we think that these gaps in governance will only be bridged when we achieve this kind of epistemological changes in the way we conceive and construct our system governance in order to incorporate other actors and knowledge systems and to comprehend reality. Because what we need is intergeneration and species solidarity. And this we don't have in Western. We only have, like the indigenous, they consider they have like how many generations back or forward to think about, or they consider that they have been another animal in their past lives, or there's whatever. But anyways, this kind of knowledge systems that should be incorporated. And also the argument by the Frankfurt School of integrating these other forms of knowing, like reason, intuition, emotion, and sensation, like Marcuse when talks about the unidimensional man. Anyway, so, and the global local initiatives that we have been finding in the field, the evidence that there is room for learning and reconceptualizing, like these two concepts, social environmentalism and social biodiversity. So perhaps there's room for bridging the gaps between traditional and contemporary knowledge systems. Okay, sorry for over. Thank you.
Hello. I had more of a summary, so I'm just gonna get to my questions. Just what I found most interesting about the article was that the researcher focused on the indigenous people, and there's over 230 different indigenous people living in Brazil, and each of them have their own country and language. So I would like to see what, not all 230 of them, but at least what are some of the crucial things that they can contribute to finding solutions to this environmental crisis. Let's see. also, I was going to say that I like how the authors acknowledge the traditional knowledge of the indigenous people. It's really crucial in finding solutions for the crisis. Normally, we don't, traditional knowledge is not promoted in mainstream literature for research. What was a little unclear for me was how are the bridges going to be, how the bridge is going to be, the gap between the government and the indigenous people. How exactly is that going to happen? How are you guys going to bring the gap between those two? So some of the question I have was, what are policies are going to be implemented? Are you guys going to do policies? How exactly are you going to get the indigenous people involved? Since what specific strategy to get them involved, given that there's so many different indigenous people and they're really crucial in finding solutions for the crisis. What I would like to see more research done on is the benefit sharing. I know you touched base on that. Considering that the indigenous people, it's kind of against their tradition to document their oral tradition because it changes from day to day. So how will you guys manage that, considering that their information is really crucial? And I don't know if I missed this in the paper or maybe I forgot because I've been nervous all day. How is what's going on in Brazil affects the rest of the world? So that's my paper. I had 4 pages, but Professor Ling said I had to cut it. Sorry.
Could you send it to me, please?
Sure. Thank you.
Basically, I'm arguing that world politics is dominated by a singular logic, and most recently is dominated by a neo-realist logic. This is the graph that Waltz presents in his book about how all of the states in the world, the X's, are enveloped in this structure that applies pressures on each state, and consequently each state operates within the same logic, and the logic is power balancing. He abstracts it, but this is a recent cover from Foreign Affairs magazine, and they have compiled a bunch, Foreign Affairs magazine, yes, they have compiled a bunch of their articles under the title Masters of International Relations, and the masters, of course, are all white males or white male wannabes. There's Francis Fukuyama there and Fareed Zakaria. And you can see that they conceive of world politics as a chess game, a very typical trope. And of course, the hand that plays the pawn is a male hand and not coincidentally a white male hand. So here you see how gender and race play subtly in this understanding of world politics. And those who like the neo-realist vision of world politics have extended it to 3 strains of thought in contemporary world politics, and I use the word strain deliberately. The first is hegemonic stability theory, which says that the world needs a hegemon. Second is democratic peace theory, which is that liberal states or democratic states don't fight each other, and therefore the world should become democratic, so we will get rid of world wars. Forgetting, of course, that liberal states fight other kinds of states in order to maintain their standard of living. And then the third vision of this is called the liberal world order, which is produced by people like Eikenberry, who was cited earlier. Anne-Marie Slaughter and John Eikenberry produced a blueprint for the future called the liberal world order, or the Princeton Project. These are all extensions of Waltz's singular neo-realist logic. The problem with this logic is that it entrenches power. It's only focused on power. As noticed regarding the hand that plays the pawn piece, it's hypermasculine, and it upholds hypermasculinity as a normative value that is superior to all others. In other words, if you don't behave in this power-grabbing, hypermasculine way, then you must be effeminate, and being feminized is a negative. All of this, of course, covers a colonial logic, because this was the logic that was used to perpetrate and justify the civilizing mission, which further perpetrates a violence which is epistemic. So this neo-realist logic applies violence not just in terms of what we do, how we behave, but also how we think. Our paper adds, this is not the whole story. The triumph is not total. Why? Because there's lots happening in the world today, and we give just 3 recent examples. The first 2 come from places outside of the so-called West, and the third comes from within the West. First of all, there's a very strong indigenous movement going on in Latin America, which the indigenous people call Abya, as opposed to Latin America, which was the name coined by the conquistadors. In 2007, a activist from the Andes, Cholango, wrote a letter to Pope Benedict XVI, basically saying, we are still here. You have not succeeded in annihilating us. Our religions did not die. They are very alive. Now, this is not just a declaration of existence, but a declaration of a return embrace to indigenous ways of thinking. In other words, you have not succeeded in completely brainwashing us. The second movement comes from places like small-scale rice farmers in the Philippines. They voluntarily switched from chemical-based agriculture to zero-chem agriculture, because they saw that even though they initially would get high returns with chemically based fertilizers on their crops, the chemical fertilizers so eroded their soil and harmed their health as well as those who ate the products, the health of those who ate their products, that in the long term it was not monetarily or ecologically or physiologically profitable. The chemical fertilizers also placed them in huge amounts of debt that they couldn't get out of. So in terms of every level of rational thinking, it was better for them to switch to zero-chem agriculture. Not only did they succeed in switching their own farms from zero-chem agriculture, they learned from the movements of other farmers located in similar farm situations like those in Korea, farmers in Korea. So a small-scale rice farmer transnational network developed. And from this network came also a revalorization of local knowledge in that local farmers used organic materials to serve as pesticides rather than chemical pesticides. They were used, for example, seaweed as a kind of pesticide. The third movement is happening from the heart of Europe, where people are sick and tired of the fast food, fast lane, fast living life that is supposed to be so glamorous and modern. And they say, stop the insanity. We want to have slow food, slow life, and in particular, slow urban development that preserves the environment. For example, restaurants serve food that are grown locally and in season, as opposed to this, transnational grocery line that we have. So here are 3 examples of actual movements taken by people on the ground to change the way they live, and to change the way they live, they have changed the way they think. Neo-realist logic, with its singular understanding of the world, cannot capture these developments on the ground that are happening both outside of the West and inside the West. And by West, I mean geographically, not normatively. These new developments represent new thinking, new actions, new social relations. They represent also the application of multiple logics in world politics. And they also underscore the need for a moral imagination. This term is coined by Lederach in his work on conflict resolution, where he says that we need to draw on these creative, aesthetic areas of our life, like art, to stimulate a moral imagination, well, which means getting outside of the normative box that has been imposed upon us by the standards of world politics that have been discussed all day long. And what happens with neorealism is that it blocks this moral imagination. It refuses to recognize the possibility of a moral imagination because to neorealist world politics, which is unfortunately contemporary world politics, there's only one way to think. And that way of thinking does not include anything like art. Consequently, I turn to an approach that I have developed called worldism, which is based on the recognition that there are multiple worlds in the world, and our world of worlds emanates from the interaction between multiple worlds. It is not this structure that Waltz identified that envelops all states, but rather through the interaction of multiple worlds, and by worlds I mean worldviews, there arises an overarching aura. I don't know what else to call it. It is porous and dynamic and not closed that accounts for our ability to communicate with one another. And for this reason, I've developed this model called Worldist Dialogics, which is how to talk across worlds. And these worlds could be within worlds as well. And I draw on specifically Taoist dialectics as an epistemological foundation. Taoist dialectics, as you may all know, talks about the relationship between yin and yang, as well as the relationships within the yin within the yang within the yin. And the yin and the yang are understood as relational opposites. The yin represents the female principle and yang the male principle. So here you see how gender is intimately intertwined with this epistemological orientation. It has both opposites and complementarity, so that we are not always in conflict, but that there are sources of connection, both inside and out. And this is the traditional diagram of the yin-yang relationship. As you see, there's black and white, but there is black within white, white within black. The Taoist dialectics as an epistemology allows us to recognize the existence of multiple logics and their interactions to produce hybrid worlds. We live in hybrid worlds. We do not live in one world, no matter how much the neorealists insist. And in these hybrid worlds, key are aesthetics and creativity. Without resort to aesthetics, we cannot draw on the creativity that exists within us. And we need both aesthetics and creativity to theorize a moral imagination for world politics. There's been a lot of work in conflict resolution, peace studies, etc., on all of these cases where people drew on individual resorts to a moral imagination to transform a situation around. But we don't get any of that in IR because these moral imaginations, these cases of moral imagination have not been theorized for IR. And this is what we are trying to do in this paper. However, we do not want to leave the situation as a dichotomy, a conflict between neorealism and worldism, as outlined here in their differences in the first two columns. Rather, we want to be true to, we want to practice what we preach, which is that there are complementarities, there are compatibilities and complicities as well. And so in the third column, we undergo a thought experiment, which is what are the kinds of hybridities that can result when we look at the complementarities within neorealism and worldism. So, for example, in the first row, neorealism sees a system that is composed of a structure with interacting parts. Worldism sees a world of worlds that arise from interactive multiple worlds. If we were to hybridize these two understandings of world politics, then we might get something like multiple systems, multiple logics. I won't go into detail with the rest of the items listed here in the columns, but just to suggest that if we were to compare these two approaches and then hybridize between them, what kind of new ideas would we come up with? What kind of new principles would we come up with that we could use to apply to actual problems in the world today? And so our paper ends with an invitation for you to play and to focus on a particular problem that fascinates you, obsesses you, frustrates you, whatever it may be, and then apply these hybrid principles to how you could solve that problem. Thank you.
Go for it. Okay. Having actually read the paper, I thought that was a pretty great presentation of everything you really should know. I really liked the chapter that I read because not only did it offer a critique on contemporary world politics, but it offers a solution and an alternative as well. And the alternative it offers is startling in many ways, but something that jumped out at me immediately was the fact that it's explicitly divined from spirituality. And I think that's the first contemporary idea of world politics that I've come across that is grounded in spirituality. And I think it was particularly effective that in your paper you drew the process from going from the inspiration in Taoism and then to reformatting it for our context and then showing how that ended up being a model of worldist dialogics. I thought that was very effective. I really like the idea of moral imagination throughout because I think most of us can agree that there isn't a lot of morality or imagination in current world politics. So I think it does a great job expressing this. And one thing I thought was, this could just be me, but or just because it was an early paper, but I noticed that there weren't that many example case studies. I felt that it read very theoretical. Mm-hmm. And I mean, right now, possibly it is very theoretical. And until that is elaborated on, I think it would be stronger. I mean, you use Syria and the Philippines, but I want more. And more on the direct application, even theoretical direct application of worldist dialogics to hypothetical scenarios would have been really helpful to me, since I lack a lot of the vocabulary that would have made this a little easier to digest.
By the way, he was a student who emailed me that reading my paper did violence to his stomach. So the digestion metaphor is not altogether that far removed.
No. I did end up liking it a lot. I got on board eventually. The pain passed. Most importantly for me, I want to see how you would offer examples of how world dialogics would approach amending neorealism's mistakes, especially in the context of former colonies, because there's a lot of history there that's going to be tough to overcome. Mm-hmm. I think you did an excellent job pointing out the flaws behind neorealism. Before I read the paper, I knew that our system needed work, but the paper gave me the vocabulary with which to back it up from different perspectives, no less. 3, I think you used. Mm-hmm. It equipped me with an entirely new method of analysis, one that, despite my lack of background, I found both approachable and appealing. And on a personal note, I feel like worldist dialogics would be really useful in encouraging a lot of improvement in the NGO culture, which is something that I am personally quite passionate about fixing. Other than that, I haven't got many more.
Great, thank you very much.
So my question is actually for Cristina, and I may have missed if you touched on this at the beginning, so I apologize if so. But my question is, you touched briefly on shamans and their knowledge that they have in this being a very transformative and spiritual source of knowledge. what I want to know is, because I know that there is also an increasing market for these kind of tours and these kind of parties, and they do appeal to a specific niche, but I just want to know how you think we can promote this kind of knowledge, because I think that there is a lot of beauty and there is a lot there that pertains to what this conference is about, but how it can simultaneously be promoted and protected from being commodified and exploited.
Okay, there's Erica.
I'm about to do exactly what I don't think anybody should do where the suggestion is that you ask a question. But rather I actually, I want to make a suggestion having to do with the politics of indigenous perspectives, particularly. And I understand this may be the intention of the book, but we tend to always focus on the global south. And I would like to suggest that we start to focus perhaps on the global far north. Specifically here, I'm thinking about Arctic indigenous peoples. This is my area of research. And even more so, the political agency, particularly of Inuit. Without going into it too much, there's numerous reasons dating back, dating way back into the colonial period and forward. And then starting when Gorbachev said at the end of the 1980s, calling the Arctic a zone of peace and insisting that the indigenous peoples have a place at the table. Fast forward, in Canada, the Inuit are recognized. It's not to be said that there's not a lot of difficulties still, but what became even more interesting was when Brookings Institute, in a recent paper that they came out with, actually acknowledged that we should...
Uh-oh. Is our time over? I guess, is our time over? I think our time... I'm sorry. But go on. Stand up. Yeah.
In terms of having agency, looking at them as victims. And I just think it's possibly a way of looking at the analysis a little bit differently. Thank you.
This is more drastic than the Oscars. My God. Other questions? Yeah, Lisa.
I think that we were all looking for ways to solve this global south thing, and maybe you did it somehow, because you're not bringing the dichotomy, global south, global north, as you were saying to. So maybe we should be looking at the solutions this way, the way we did it in our chapter. I need to read it, so maybe this is what we need to discuss in our meeting. The second comment is about your table, though. João and I, when we were teaching IR theory in Rio, we decided to avoid having realists and then liberals, and they set the field for us, and then all the others seem to be answering the realists. Because when you start with them, you are making everyone else responding to them because they are establishing what the field is. So when I saw your table, I immediately thought about, well, your second column seems to be trying to match the first column. So that doesn't do a favor to your argument. I would, for instance, suggest to have your column and then see how neorealism answers to it or somehow. Not put the neorealism first and then your arguments that comes. It seems as if you are answering and you are trying to match and you're trying to say that you are doing it better. But it's not that you don't care, but what you're saying is different from what neorealism is saying.
I have a response to you, but I think there are other hands. Yeah.
It's just on that same point, actually. And I was also thinking of that chart and thinking realism, as you presented, is essentially ideology. And worlding is not quite that. So in a sense, you created this equation between the two by listing them side by side in that way, and I didn't feel like you were quite trying to place them in that type of relation. I don't know, maybe you go through this in some way and talk about it.
I think we're not in or something. Yeah, it's part of my book.
I'm sad to see it go, is what I wanted to say.
But there's a reference to it.
Yeah. Simply because I think, and the whole idea of indigenous cosmovisions, I think Taoism has affinities
Yes.
with Andean cosmovision, and perhaps with other indigenous cosmovisions, and I think that would be a point to at least make beyond citing, simply because this would make worldism almost, if not a universal, I know we don't like to use that term, but something that transcends Taoism, and which is similar to other cosmovisions.
There are other questions? Comments? Martha?
Yeah, it's more like a question that I'm struggling with in my research and also in my life. And it's the following. I'm from Spain, and we don't even know if we are global south or global north now. So it's kind of this kind of shifting of the global south, which is not like geography, but another thing. And the other thing within that is that if you ask some of my friends in activism in Madrid, do you want more state like a global south activist or less state? They probably say yes and no, because we now have the welfare state, but only for the most part, the bureaucracy and the containment and control and repression instruments. But we are kind of losing the public education or the healthcare. So what is the state we want more and want less? That's a tricky question, because now Europe, I don't want to put Europe again in the center if we are thinking about global south, but it's not like univocal. You have the whole Greek, Italy, Portugal, Spain, which may have some more empathy with Argentinians in the 80s, perhaps not now, which is kind of a temporality in that than with German or French people. So just wanted to kind of ask the question of who is the global south now, and what is the state in this new change? Yes?
Tony Colbert, visiting scholar to the New School. I've only caught this last session, so in your definitions with neo-realism, are you looking at the organized church and organized religion of Christianity and Islam as being part of the colonial, if you like, overlay, and the need to look back to, or forward to, reasserting the role of animist religions, which have come from the indigenous people and from their own relationships to the ecology of the area they live, rather than what is seen, if you like, in, say, with the Christian churches coming in and seizing the land to hand over to the conquistadors. So we are looking, if you like, as a pushback in terms of your worldist dialogue, which would reassert or give place for the animist religions that were displaced. Is that part of your dialogue? And I will read your work.
I'd like to give Cristina a chance to respond to the question posed to her, and then I will respond.
Well, perhaps you don't have an answer. I think it's what we put our second case, case that was this unfinished business. They think there's this whole problem of how you acknowledge and promote traditional knowledge without outside or beyond the modern framework. Because what I've been noticing is that they don't want shamans' knowledge to be commodified. And so far the discussions are on how you put patent systems on their knowledge. As they say, the body painting cannot be recognized as a design or like an industrial design. And this whole debate is
going on among the indigenous peoples in Brazil, and also with some Inuits or whatever, when they meet at this global biodiversity conferences. But it's unsolved because there is this whole pressure of commodification. Yes, and people go in there, and there are tours to try ayahuasca or shuma, that's the Indian that comes from the cactus. And so I think that's something that has not been solved, but there has been resistance to commodification, because what I've been read, like the anthropologists say that this has a whole context, and if you take out of the context, it loses the whole meaning of it. So the only way a shaman can look at the structure of a plant through their visions is when they are in that context of the tribe, and or also the meaning they attribute to that to solve problems for the community. It's not something that we should do it just because. That's something I have been reading recently. So it's I've been trying to incorporate, because I think it's the only way forward to think about sustainability and to go beyond anthropocentrism and this duality. The problem is our whole societies, we see how we have been organizing economics and politics. It's very separated from nature. That's why we have so many boundaries. Like, all the territorial boundaries of the nation state, they don't correspond to the ecosystems. Like in the Amazon, you have 8 countries in the Amazon. So how do you deal with the Amazon thinking about 8 countries there? Or in Brazil, the southern Congo, if you think about the southern Plata Basin, if you have 3 countries, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, 4 countries in a, they share water system basin, and they are countries. And that has happened all over the world, so that's a big problem.
Well, thank you so much for all of your comments. I am looking at logic. And so in that sense, I'm going beyond the state. I'm looking at the logic that constructs the state and that accounts for the state. And so that's why I thought it was important to address the most important logic which is being used in contemporary world politics, which is neo-realist logic. And in a sense, I disagree with you, Jonathan. It's not just an ideology, but it's a cognitive tradition. It's an application of a particular kind of scientific approach to world politics, and that's why it has had so much traction since Waltz first articulated it in these behavioralist terms. It's not to say that he was the one who invented neo-realist logic, but that he was able to articulate it in this very scientific behavioralist way, the problem with reductionism and systemic theory and all of that stuff. And that's why it's so powerful. And it is able to cover for logic. That's the postmodern critique of neo-realism, that it is ideology, but it's covered by science. The pairing of the two in the table is not to say, here I'm showing how worldism responds to neo-realism, but rather what are the common elements within both, and how difference and commonality exists simultaneously, so that you can say, for example, neo-realism focuses on power, whereas worldism focuses on dialogics. These seem very different, and yet at the same time, if we were to look at them as complementary, then what will we get as a result? So it's not really worldism is adjusting to what neo-realism is. Neo-realism is X, therefore worldism is Y, but rather that X and Y exist within these two traditions, and if we see them as complementary, what will we get? Z. And we don't know what that is yet, and that's why I invite people to play. Although in the paper, we do fill out the table, and we ask people to use these principles that we fill out to apply to a particular problem that they might want to understand in a particular way. Regarding your comment about animism, the point of worldism is not simply to be a kind of smorgasbord approach to the world, which is that animists have a right to speak and Christians have a right to speak, but rather to look at the interaction, the dialogic between them. And in this interaction, it's not looking only at the substance of what passes, but the logics behind. So that it's not simply saying, oh, animists have as much right to kill. Oh, thank you. It's not to say that animists have as much right to practice their rituals as Catholics do, but rather, what is it about animist logic and Catholic logic that can enable a communication between the two such that we recognize the differences between them, but the differences don't alienate us? I mean, this is the key in world politics. We have to recognize that there are differences, but these differences do not need to alienate us. Currently, under neo-realist logic, because it claims that there's only one logic for world politics, therefore, difference is a source of alienation. If you are different, if you think differently or behave differently, then either you adjust, you learn how to be like the neo-realists, or you are exiled, you are rejected, you're sent outside into that netherworld where terrorists live. And so the whole point of worldism is to say that we all have ontological parity, which is one of the principles of Taoism. And given that we have ontological parity, how can we talk to one another? And I would say that the Taoist perspective also allows for a recognition of the problem that Marta pointed out, which is the global south within the global north, and the global north within the global south. Are there any other questions, comments? No? I would like to thank all of you for attending our conference today. It's been a long stretch of thinking hard, so I really appreciate all of those of you who have stayed all day. And in particular, I thank my students, those who survived the experience. You made me proud, each one of you. And I thank also our colleagues who served as discussants, and especially I thank all of our international guests who have flown long distances to be here with us today. And lastly, but not least, I thank my A-team of assistants who performed so smoothly and excellently that I'm getting spoiled. I'm now like thinking, this is how I should live. So anyway, thank you all.